All right, let's dive into something pretty important today. Um, the U.S. Treasury Department.
Not exactly the most exciting topic.
You might not think so, but stick with us.
We promised it's interesting.
We're going to go through this document called Mandate for Leadership.
Yeah, specifically Chapter 22.
It's basically a conservative wish list.
Kind of their vision for the Treasury.
What they'd like to see happen there in 2025.
And some of these ideas, well, let's just say they're pretty bold.
So this document, it goes way beyond just, dry financial stuff.
It gets into all sorts of things.
Tax policy, how we regulate Wall Street, international relations.
Even hot-button issues like equity and climate change.
Exactly. So it's like a blueprint.
Yeah, for how a whole chunk of the government could look different.
Now, you might be thinking, why should I care about what some government department does?
Right. It can seem pretty far removed from everyday life.
But the truth is, the Treasury's decisions, they impact you every single day.
Think about taxes. Think about how stable our economy is.
It all traces back to them.
And this chapter, it starts by really laying into the current Treasury Department.
Under Secretary Yellen,
They're pretty critical.
they basically say she's focusing on the wrong things.
Blaming her for things like the growing national debt and inflation.
They use this phrase mission drift,
Yeah, they say the Treasury's gone off course.
focusing on things like equity and climate change.
Instead of what they consider the core responsibilities.
They actually pull quotes directly from the Treasury's own strategic plan.
To make their point,
And then they get into how they'd fix things
starting with a major overhaul.
of the entire U.S. tax system.
The whole thing.
Okay, so less mission drift and more tax reform.
That's the gist of it.
Where do they even begin with something like that?
Well, they actually suggest two levels of change.
Two levels.
Yeah, first, what they call intermediate reforms.
Okay, so these are things that could be done within the current system.
Exactly, like simplifying income tax down to just two rates.
Just two.
Yeah, 15% and 30%.
And cutting the corporate tax rate to 18%.
They also want to create something called universal savings accounts.
What are those?
It's kind of like a souped-up savings account to help people build wealth.
So streamlining, lowering taxes. Got it.
But then they go even further.
With something they call fundamental reform.
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What is that?
They actually want to completely move away from income tax
Get rid of it entirely.
and switch to a consumption tax.
Wow, that's a pretty big change.
Their argument is this would be less harmful to the economy and to make
Well,
sure these big changes stick.
like prevent them from being reversed.
Exactly. They suggest requiring a supermajority vote in Congress to raise taxes.
To make it much harder to undo.
They're not messing around.
Definitely not. And speaking of shaking things up,
They have a lot to say about the IRS.
they don't hold back. They call it a mess.
Poorly managed, unresponsive, too political.
They're especially concerned about that $80 billion expansion of the IRS.
Yeah, the one that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act.
They think it's going to make the IRS way too powerful.
And intrusive.
So what's their solution? How do they want to fix the IRS?
Well, they have a few ideas.
All right, let's hear them.
First, they want to give the president more control over the IRS
More control. How would they do that?
by increasing the number of people he can appoint to leadership positions.
So basically giving the executive branch more power over the agency.
That's the idea.
Interesting. What else?
They also want to completely overhaul the IRS's technology systems.
That's a tall order.
They actually suggest an oversight board of private sector tech experts.
To make sure it's done right.
Because, let's face it, the government isn't exactly known for its cutting-edge tech.
That's for sure.
They want to bring in some outside expertise.
So more power to the executive branch.
Yeah.
And a tech makeover for the IRS.
And along with reforming the IRS, they also talk about protecting taxpayer rights and privacy.
Okay, interesting. What's their angle there?
They want to see some pretty big changes.
Like what?
For one, they want to equalize the interest rates,
Meaning?
making them the same whether you owe the IRS money or they owe you.
Right now it's totally lopsided.
You get penalized way more for paying late than the government pays you for being late with a refund.
It does seem unfair. What else?
They also want to give taxpayers more time to sue the IRS.
If they feel they've been wronged.
Exactly. And they're suggesting a big budget increase for the Taxpayer Advocate Service, an independent part of the IRS that helps people navigate issues and disputes.
So making the IRS less scary.
And a lot more user-friendly.
That's their vision.
But it doesn't stop there.
Oh!
This chapter goes global.
Okay, on to the world stage.
We're getting into the U.S.'s role in international affairs.
Okay, so we've gone from taxes to the IRS to the world stage. What's their take on how the U.S. should be acting globally?
They're calling for a much more assertive approach.
Assertive meaning?
Well, particularly when it comes to organizations like the World Bank and the IMF.
Those big international financial institutions.
They want the U.S. to really use its influence.
Yeah. To push for policies that are in line with U.S. interests.
Rather than just going along with the status quo.
So a more America-first approach.
Yeah, we could say that.
They even suggest the U.S. should consider withdrawing from the World Bank and the IMF altogether.
That's right.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic move. What's their thinking there? Why ditch these institutions?
They argue the U.S. would have more control over its foreign aid and policies.
If it acted unilaterally?
Cut out the middleman, so to speak.
And speaking of cutting things out, they have some strong opinions on China.
That's not surprising. China's a big topic these days.
What do they want to see happen with China?
Well, they're really focused on countering China's influence.
Both economic and geopolitical.
It's a major theme throughout this whole chapter.
So how do they propose tackling that? What's their strategy?
They're targeting something called CFIUS.
CFIUS.
Yeah, it stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States.
Okay, not exactly a catchy name.
But basically, it's the group that decides whether a foreign company buying a U.S. business poses a national security risk.
So it's all about vetting those foreign investments, especially from China.
To make sure they're not a threat.
They want to give CFIUS more power.
To really scrutinize those investments.
And potentially block them.
If they think they could give China access to sensitive technologies.
Or weaken critical U.S. industries.
They're worried about those kinds of things.
So a more cautious and strategic approach to dealing with China.
That's one way to put it.
But it's not just China. They also talk about financial regulation in general, right?
That's right. They propose a pretty big restructuring of the whole system.
The whole financial regulatory system.
The whole thing.
Okay, so what's their goal with that? What are they trying to achieve?
They say they want to promote innovation, reduce costs for businesses.
Less red tape, more efficiency.
And close regulatory gaps.
Sounds good in theory.
They suggest merging several regulatory agencies.
Merging them.
Combining them.
And creating new types of charters for financial firms. Okay, so less bureaucracy, more innovation. I get it.
That's the basic idea.
But what about this idea of new charters? How would that work?
These charters would basically give financial firms a choice.
A choice?
Yeah, they could stick with the traditional, stricter regulations.
Or
they could opt for a new charter.
More
fewer rules, but with higher requirements for things like capital reserves and risk management.
So firms could choose the level of regulation they're comfortable with.
Based on their business model and risk appetite.
Interesting, but wouldn't that create a sort of two-tiered system?
Where some firms are subject to stricter rules than others?
Potentially, yeah.
That's one of the potential downsides for sure.
It seems like it could create an uneven playing field.
Maybe even encourage some firms to take on more risk than they should.
It's a tricky balance to strike.
And speaking of tricky balances, they have a lot to say about anti-money laundering regulations.
And beneficial ownership reporting.
They're pretty critical of FinCEN.
Which is?
The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network.
Okay.
They say it's not transparent enough.
So less red tape and more transparency from FinCEN.
Exactly.
And they also take aim at the Corporate Transparency Act.
The one that requires companies to disclose their beneficial owners?
So the real people who control the company?
Right.
That seems like a good thing, though, knowing who's really behind these companies.
Well, their argument is it's a burden on small businesses.
Without actually doing much to stop criminals.
They say criminals will always find ways to hide their identities.
So they're advocating for a more streamlined and targeted approach to fighting financial crime.
They want to make sure it's effective and not overly burdensome.
Streamlining seems to be a common thread here.
Yeah, whether it's taxes, regulations, or even the structure of the government itself.
But there's one area where they seem to want to completely dismantle things.
And that's the Treasury's equity agenda.
They don't hold back there.
Nope.
They want to get rid of pretty much every office and initiative related to racial equity.
They call these initiatives racist policymaking.
And they want to root out things like critical race theory and DEI programs within the Treasury Department.
That's right.
That's a pretty strong stance.
And it's bound to be controversial.
What about their stance on climate change? Do they address that as well?
Oh, yeah, they definitely do.
Okay, and what's their take?
They're highly critical of the Treasury's focus on climate change.
So a complete rejection of the current administration's approach.
Absolutely.
What exactly are they calling for?
They want to shut down the Climate Hub office and pull the U.S. out of agreements like the Paris Agreement.
They argue that these initiatives are ineffective.
And actually hurt the U.S. economy.
Well, that's certainly a lot to digest.
This chapter covers a wide range of issues.
and proposes some pretty drastic changes.
It really does.
It's important to understand what these proposals are,
And what they could mean for the country.
even if you don't agree with all of them.
Absolutely.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack. One of the things that really jumps out at me from this chapter is just how much it emphasizes economic growth.
Yeah, they seem to think that's the solution to pretty much everything.
Tax cuts, deregulation, that's their answer.
It's a pretty classic conservative approach.
Definitely.
But I do wonder, does it always work?
You mean, do tax cuts always lead to economic growth?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good in theory, but
It's a question economists have been debating for decades.
the effectiveness of supply-side economics.
There's no easy answer.
And even the chapter itself acknowledges that those tax cuts could lead to a bigger deficit.
Especially if they're not paired with spending cuts.
Right. They talk a big game about fiscal responsibility.
But they're pretty vague on where those spending cuts would actually come from.
It's like they're painting this picture of a balanced budget.
Without getting into the messy details.
Which programs get cut? What services get reduced?
Those are the tough questions.
And that's where things get really political.
Because as soon as you start talking about cutting spending, you're talking about priorities.
What's essential, what's not?
What role should the government play in people's lives?
Those are tough questions. No easy answers.
And speaking of tough questions, it's hard to ignore the fact that this chapter is coming from a very specific perspective.
Yeah, it's definitely a conservative vision for the Treasury Department.
And while it's important to understand that perspective,
It's equally important to consider other viewpoints.
and potential downsides that might not be fully addressed here.
Can you give me some examples? Like, where do you see potential blind spots?
Well, take their proposal to withdraw from organizations like the World Bank and the IMF.
They argue that it would give the U.S. more control.
But wouldn't it also risk isolating us on the world stage?
That's a good point. It could make it harder to collaborate with other countries.
To achieve shared goals?
Sometimes working together through these institutions can be more effective than going it alone.
There's a lot of nuance to these international relationships.
That the chapter doesn't really address.
What about their take on the equity agenda?
That seems like another area where there could be unintended consequences.
Labeling these initiatives as racist policymaking is incredibly inflammatory.
It feels like it could actually create more division.
And tension, not less.
And calling for the elimination of DEI programs within the Treasury could really set back efforts to make the government more diverse and inclusive.
It's important to listen to concerns about these programs.
But I think it's dangerous to go too far in the opposite direction.
It's all about finding that balance.
Between competing priorities and viewpoints.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this chapter.
What do you mean?
It shows just how complex and interconnected these issues are.
There are no simple solutions.
No black and white, just a lot of gray areas.
And it's our responsibility as citizens to engage in these debates.
To think critically about the choices our leaders are making.
We can't just passively accept one side or the other.
We need to weigh the evidence, consider different perspectives.
And form our own informed opinion.
Exactly, and that's why these deep dives are so valuable.
They help us unpack these complicated topics.
And understand the nuances.
Speaking of nuances, what about their stance on climate change?
Another area where they seem to be taking a pretty hard line.
Yeah, they're calling for a complete U-turn on current climate policies.
Pulling out of the Paris Agreement, shutting down the Climate Hub office.
It's a pretty sweeping rejection of the idea that the government should be involved in addressing climate change.
And it's definitely a controversial stance.
They argue that these initiatives are harmful to the economy.
But there's a growing consensus among scientists that climate change is real.
And poses a significant threat to the planet.
So it's another one of the situations where there are strong arguments on both sides.
Zooming out a bit, what does this chapter tell us about the potential direction of economic and financial policy if a new administration takes over?
It definitely suggests a shift toward a more conservative approach.
Lower taxes, less regulation.
A more go-it-alone attitude on the world stage.
It raises a big question. What are the potential consequences of such a shift?
That's the billion-dollar question.
And it's something we'll need to keep a close eye on as events unfold.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about and discuss.
Agreed. And it's important to remember that these are just proposals.
Whether or not they actually get implemented will depend on a whole host of factors.
The 2024 election, of course.
But even if a new administration comes in with a mandate for change,
There's no guarantee they'll be able to push through all of these ideas.
politics is messy,
There are always competing interests at play.
but it's still valuable to have these conversations.
And explore different perspectives.
I completely agree. It helps us better understand the challenges we face as a country.
and the potential paths forward,
And that's what the deep dive is all about.
giving you the information and insights you need to navigate a complex world.
And hopefully prompting some thought-provoking conversations along the way.
Now we've covered a lot of ground here.
But there's one area I still want to dig into a bit deeper.
Which is?
Their proposals for reforming financial regulation.
Right, they talk about merging agencies, creating new charters for financial firms.
Streamlining the regulatory system.
Yeah, it sounds good in theory.
But what about the potential downsides?
Could these reforms actually make the financial system more vulnerable?
It's definitely a possibility.
Less regulation could mean more opportunities for risky behavior.
And think back to the 2008 financial crisis.
That was partly caused by deregulation and a lack of oversight.
Exactly. It's a reminder that there needs to be a balance.
Between promoting innovation and protecting the system from collapse.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It really is, and one that requires careful consideration and analysis.
Okay, so let's break down their specific proposals.
All right, let's do it.
First up, merging agencies.
What exactly are they suggesting?
They want to combine the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency,
Okay.
the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the National Credit Union Administration.
So all those agencies would become one super agency.
That's the idea.
And their rationale for that is
They argue it would streamline bank supervision
make things more efficient.
and reduce redundancy in the regulatory system.
So one-stop shopping for bank regulation.
You could say that.
But wouldn't that also concentrate a lot of power in one place?
It's a valid concern.
And some argue that it could make it harder to address issues that are unique to different types of financial institutions.
It's important to have diverse perspectives and expertise within the regulatory system.
Definitely something to keep in mind when evaluating these proposals.
Now, another interesting idea they float is creating new charters for financial firms.
Right, this idea of giving firms a choice between traditional regulations.
And a new, less regulated charter with higher capital requirements.
The novel approach.
But it also raises some questions.
Like what? What are some of the potential pitfalls?
Well, for one, it could create a two-tiered system.
Or some firms are subject to stricter rules than others.
Exactly.
And that could lead to unfair competition,
Or regulatory arbitrage.
where firms try to exploit loopholes in the system.
It's something that regulators would need to think through very carefully.
They need to make sure that these new charters don't weaken the overall stability of the financial system.
They'd have to make sure the capital requirements and risk management standards are robust enough.
To offset the reduced regulation.
It's a lot to consider.
There are a lot of moving parts when it comes to financial regulation.
Absolutely, and it's constantly evolving.
Even if these specific proposals aren't implemented, they're likely to spark more discussion and innovation in the field
It's an ongoing conversation.
about how to find that sweet spot between promoting growth and protecting the system from risk.
And it's a conversation that affects all of us.
Well said. So we've unpacked their proposals on financial regulation,
And it sounds like there's a lot to unpack.
but we've only scratched the surface of this chapter.
There are still some pretty provocative and challenging ideas we need to explore.
Right?
Their views on financial warfare and their critique of U.S. investment in China.
Okay, those sound like topics that deserve a deeper dive.
And that's exactly what we'll do in part 3 of this deep dive into the U.S. Treasury Department.
Okay, we're back
For the final part of our deep dive,
into this mandate for leadership document.
things are about to get pretty intense.
Yeah, we're talking about financial warfare, China.
Some pretty big picture questions about America's role in the world.
This chapter isn't afraid to push the envelope.
That's for sure.
All right, let's start with this idea of financial warfare.
They actually talk about creating a whole school of financial warfare,
Within the Treasury Department,
working closely with the Department of Defense.
it's a pretty striking image, almost like training financial soldiers.
They're saying the U.S. needs to be ready to use financial tools as weapons
Sanctions, asset freezes, that kind of thing.
to achieve its foreign policy goals.
They argue that in today's world, financial power is just as important as military power.
They point to what happened with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine.
How the U.S. and its allies use sanctions to cripple the Russian economy.
Right. They see that as a prime example of how financial warfare can be effective.
But it also raises a lot of ethical questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Sanctions can hurt ordinary people, not just governments.
And there's always the risk of escalation and unintended consequences.
It's a really complex issue.
And I think the chapter glosses over some of those complexities.
It's easy to talk about financial warfare in the abstract.
But the real-world impact can be messy and unpredictable.
Okay, so moving on from financial warfare.
Let's talk about China.
The chapter spends a lot of time critiquing U.S. investment in China.
They're basically saying that a lot of U.S. companies investing in China are shooting themselves in the foot.
They're worried about companies transferring technology or intellectual property.
That could end up bolstering China's military capabilities.
Yeah. They also raise concerns about U.S. companies becoming too reliant on China for critical supplies,
Which could make us vulnerable in a crisis.
their whole focus is on national security and economic competitiveness,
They argue that the U.S. needs to be much more strategic.
and selective about where it invests its money.
And they specifically call out China as a potential risk.
But disentangling our economies completely seems pretty unrealistic, doesn't it?
I mean, the U.S. and China are deeply interconnected.
It's a tricky situation for sure.
There are definitely valid concerns about China's ambitions.
And its track record on human rights and intellectual property.
But shutting down all investment could backfire.
And hurt both economies.
It's about finding that balance again.
Protecting national interests without undermining economic growth.
Exactly. And that's a tightrope walk that policymakers are going to have to continue to navigate.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive,
I want to go back to something we touched on earlier.
the potential unintended consequences of some of these proposals.
Yeah, with any big policy change, there's always a ripple effect.
It's like throwing a rock into a pond.
You can't always predict how the waves will spread.
And that's why it's so important to think critically.
Not just about the intended outcomes, but also the potential downsides.
Like, take their push for massive tax cuts.
It sounds great on the surface.
But what if it leads to an even bigger deficit?
And what happens if they have to make drastic spending cuts to compensate?
Right. Those spending cuts could end up hurting the very people they're claiming to help.
And their proposals to deregulate the financial system.
What if that leads to another financial crisis?
And their stance on equity.
What if that actually makes it harder to address systemic inequalities?
These are all important questions that we need to be asking.
It's not enough to just look at the surface level of these proposals
We need to dig deeper.
and consider the full range of potential impacts.
So what does all of this mean? What's the big takeaway from this deep dive into the U.S. Treasury Department?
I think the key takeaway is that the Treasury is at a critical juncture.
It's facing a whole bunch of challenges.
From the national debt to China's rise
And the decisions made by the next administration will have a huge impact.
on our economy and our place in the world.
This chapter, whether you agree with it or not, shows just how much is at stake.
It's a call for a pretty dramatic shift in direction.
And it's up to all of us as citizens to stay informed
Engage in these debates.
and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive.
Give you the tools and information you need to navigate these complex issues.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
But it's just the beginning of the conversation.
We encourage you to keep learning
Keep asking questions.
and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.